is the After the Glass Break series, and I'm your host, David Harrison. Throughout this series, we'll take a candid look through the lenses of culturally diverse technology leaders to discuss their rise through the glass ceiling and what happened immediately after glass breaks. Today's guest is Adrianne C, and C stands for the coolest person you'll ever meet, Smith, SVP, Senior Partner, and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at FleishmanHillard. Adrianne, welcome to the ride.
Why, thank you. I'm super excited. And the redefinition of what that C stands for, I will take it. And I am glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So happy to have you here. Adrianne, what we like to do is we want to take our audience on a journey. Okay. And the journey is really getting them a better understanding of you, some of the trials and tribulations and triumphs that you've experienced as you have gone through your life and in corporate America, and then your rise through the glass ceiling and what happens immediately after those glass ceilings broke within your career. So, Adrianne, where'd you grow up?
So I am from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, believe it or not. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. Roll Tide. I was born in a mixed religion household. My father was Muslim and my mom was Christian. So my mom would pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," next to my father, who would face the east and say, "Bismillah Rahman Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen." So you can imagine, what the Christmas holiday was like. We didn't have a Christmas tree. We had a Christmas couch. And every December 25th, my father never received a Christmas present, but he would always get new socks and new underwear on December 25th. Always, just miraculously it would show up. So we found ways to manage that space and negotiate really well what I think some, as we know, countries fight wars over. In my house, this difference in religion played well because I think we learn the basic tenets of any religion and any spiritual community and context, and that is love and respect. Those are the foundations of it all. So that's where I grew up and how I grew up in the short version.
That's interesting. And growing up, and again, I'm gonna do it again, Roll Tide. Growing up in Tuscaloosa with that dichotomy of spirits in the house.
Yes.
Were you your only child, or did you have sisters and brothers?
So I'm the youngest of five, and I'm 5 years separated to my closest sibling. So I would always hear, and they're all close with at least 1 or 2 years apart. And they would always tell me that I was adopted and that I was left on the step. So you can imagine the fun I had as growing up as the youngest child of five.
That's funny. And I'm the youngest in my family as well. And I'm my sisters, there's 4 of us. My siblings are all 1 year apart. And then I was 3 years apart from my youngest. So some similarities there, but they didn't tease me about being adopted, but the teasing was about my mom and the fact that, she thought she was done with having kids and I showed up. So I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing.
Mistake. I'm sorry. Not that, more or less, not that I was adopted because I look exactly like my mother, but that I was a mistake. And so I don't know.
There we go. That was mine.
Mistake or adopted. That one.
That was mine. I was the mistake child.
Exactly.
Well, interesting. The help me understand and the audience understand that dichotomy of spirits in the house, and did that strengthen you or cause you to have mixed emotions as you were growing up?
It made us work harder in terms of connecting to who we would be and how we would identify as human beings, because they did not decide for us. They allowed us to choose. So at some point, I remember going to the masjid with my father. And my mom actually at some point was going, but she wasn't raised that way. So she ended up not going to the masjid. And in the South, it was from the Islamic point of view, if you're in Alabama, you're going where the Black Muslims are. So it was kind of Nation of Islam, power to the people, versus Orthodox,
Right.
Islam. But although my father was an Orthodox Muslim, but, that community met primarily through sort of the Nation of Islam and that connection. So I learned a lot about my being very proud of who I am as a Black woman, from the Black community. That was sort of what I got from that experience, with my
Right.
father. And of course, the belief is that if you are breathing and living, you are a Muslim, because to be a Muslim means to be one who submits to the will of God, by definition. Um, but going to church with my mom, there was often more of a spiritual connection, to God, or to religion. And so I think that was probably the difference, and more of a centering in my inner being and self, and how do we connect and love, and um, kind of this space and respect where we are in the world may have come from there. So I think the ability for me to negotiate, the ability for me to be empathetic, to different communities and people who were not like me, really started, growing up in that household, and being able to listen, learning how to agree, without necessarily having to, well, to disagree without necessarily having to have a conflict in that situation, but just understanding from a space of grace, was a huge thing, I think, and a key lesson for growing up in that type of household.
That is interesting. So in your surrounding neighborhoods, were there corporate people that was there business
No.
makers so how was the neighborhood?
So the neighborhood, I lived in a Black neighborhood on the west side of town, on the other side of the train track. So if you know about growing up in the South, on the other side of the train track, on the west side or the south side, that's where I grew up. Um, and my dad was very much about keeping us in the neighborhood, right? Although he owned his own business and he owned lots of real estate and houses, in the community, he wanted us to be in it and of it. My mom, so I was kind of like what I call an HBCU brat. So I grew up on campuses, HBCU. When I was born, she worked at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa. So that's where we were there. And then we moved to Talladega, because she worked at Talladega. And then we moved to Marshall, Texas, to where Wiley College was. But I just grew up sort of in that world of being very connected to the, um, community, and never forgetting where I came from, who I was, what I'm about, to being in a very sort of expected, growth opportunity in terms of education and learning. Although my mom was on the business side of the college and administrator, we were very connected into, the next step is college. That wasn't a question or if, it was just a natural part of your trajectory as you're growing up. So, very connected to the community, very connected to, what was real, what wasn't real, our neighborhood versus the other side of the tracks. It was very black and white. Maybe we had one Asian, in terms of the school systems that we went to. So we
Right.
didn't have that diversity of ethnicities that much in the South, or we didn't kind of recognize it, as it were. So it was kind of that space of learning. And I don't know if you're old enough or remember, there was a time where they bused students to school to create that integrated space. So
Mhm.
all of the sixth graders in Tuscaloosa went to the same high school, or the same sixth grade together, just so that we could mix. And all of the seventh graders did the same thing, and eighth, and so forth. But it allowed us to move outside of our communities of only going to a Black school versus only going to a white school, and your zip code and neighborhood, so that you mixed and kind of got to know people from different groups and communities. And it was a huge, I guess we can call it an experiment, because of course, they struck it down and now people can go back to their separate schools. But some of the connections that we made with people from different races at the time, I still have those connections today, and we still learned, and we're able to grow together, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's the running joke for me. And yes, I am of age. That's the running joke for me that I've said before. Like, I didn't know I was from a low income environment until I was bused to the north side of town. And I realized, like, okay, we're poor.
Right. Oh, what does that mean?
What
Right.
is
Yeah,
that? Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
You know, I grew up in the South as well. I grew up in Georgia, so you know, the stories that you're telling me are just harkening back to my youth as well. So, only difference that, you know, was the religious side, that you had the two different type of religions that you grew up in. But it seems to me, what I'm hearing and what the audience is hearing right now, that was a strength versus a
Oh,
weakness for you, right?
yeah.
So, your mom and dad seems to be very business oriented. And then you mentioned college was not if, it was a when, and how. So how
Yeah.
did that, for you, as you're starting to grow and make decisions, how was that decision made on which school you decided to go to?
Oh, so this might be a shallow story. I
Okay.
knew I had to go to an HBCU. That was a question. My parents were saying if I wanted my college education paid for, I had to, at a minimum, go to an HBCU for the first 2 years, and then afterwards, we could decide where we wanted to go. But of course, once you got there, you're like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. I'm in it. Um, my oldest brother, who is, and how I made the decision of which college I would go to, my oldest brother is 10 years older than me. So his freshman year, I was in the first grade. So I was 6 or 7 years old. And he brought home his yearbook. He went to Morehouse College in Atlanta.
Mhm.
And in the yearbook was an 8 by 10 glossy of Miss Maroon and White, which is their homecoming queen. And at 7 years old, I was like, oh my God, I want my picture in this book. He's that shallow little 7-year-old kid. He's like, well, the only way that you can get your picture in this book is that you have to go to Spelman College. And I said, bet, 7 years old, I'm going to Spelman College. All through high school, that's all I said. I'm going to Spelman College. I didn't apply to any other school but Spelman College. And then this devastating thing happened where my mom came and picked me up from school today, and she's like, Spelman did not even consider your application, so you're not going to be able to go. And just imagine the most dramatic
Mm.
scene from a movie where the little kid slings herself against the wall and slides down and is like, why? No! Devastated.
Yeah.
Um, Fortunately, and I didn't understand why, and she's apparently your application was not complete. And I was like, that's an impossibility. So, because I know what I was supposed to do in my part. So I talked to my senior counselor at the time. And, when you're growing up in Texas, they are guiding students to all the Texas schools. And if it was a Black college, you were going to go to Wiley, which was local, or you were going to go to TSU, Texas Southern, or
Yeah.
somewhere like that, or I
Prairie View.
forget. Prairie View,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, so I don't think she had a clue, because she was a white woman, of the importance of Spelman in my world. And she didn't send the back of my transcript with my test score. Well, the back, whatever the counselor was supposed to do, she didn't do. Um, so I went to my 10th grade counselor, who was a Black woman, and she understood the importance of Spelman in any young woman's, Black woman's life. And, this is how the universe and God, in my mind, exists, and there's an energy that's around you. For some odd reason, there was a woman who was supposed to be on the board, or was on the board at Spelman College, was coming to Marshall, Texas. Now, if you know anything about Marshall, Texas, it's only like 20 20,000 people in this town. And she was coming to speak on a panel at the Marshall, Texas Civic Center. Random.
Wow.
And she told me, she said, Adrianne, go to this forum at the Marshall, Texas Civic, Marshall Community um, Center, and meet this woman and tell her your story. So I went to the talk that she had, and afterwards I went up to her and I was like, and I don't even remember her name. That's like the tragic thing about it. And I told her my story. I was like, this is the only school I wanted to go to. And I applied and they didn't send the back of my transcript with my grades. And I know I did everything I was supposed to do, because when you take those tests, the ACTs and SATs, you
Right.
identify what
Where
school
you
you want
want to
to
send it
test
to.
for.
Yep.
Yes. So I'm like, I know they have my test score. So what are they saying? And so she says, well, I tell you what, write a letter to the president of the college, who at the time was Janetta B. Cole, and this was her first year, and tell her what happened, put my name in the letter, and we'll see what happens. So went home on the typewriter. Anybody remember
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
typewriter with my what was that, liquid paper, having to
Liquid
scratch
paper. Yep.
um, scratching out, singles, typing away, sent that letter to Dr. Cole. And I'd say about 2.5 weeks later, I got that note saying, congratulations and welcome to Spelman College. And I was floored. And this is when they were like, I'm sorry, there's no room left in the inn. There are no dorms. The classrooms are full. You have to wait. But just with this one connection and reaching out, not being afraid to, speak my voice and claim my space, I guess I was able to get accepted. And then I'd say 3 years later, my junior year, I called my brother and said, guess whose picture is going to be in your yearbook? And he's like, no way. And I was like, yes way, my picture's going to be in the book. So I was able to become Miss Morehouse College, Miss Maroon and White, and I got my picture in the book. And that was kind of the only reason I wanted to go to Spelman at the time. Like I said, is a shallow story. I wanted my picture in the book, because afterwards I was like, oh, now what? I'm supposed I'm supposed to be here to get an
To learn.
education, get my picture in the book. But it was just an incredible time. And my whole family came. My brother was there. They were so proud, during the homecoming and coronation, which is big, at HBCUs. And it was just one of those moments that in hindsight, I learned that I have the ability to call things into being. I have the ability to visualize, and that power to make things happen. You can visualize, you can make and take the steps that you need to happen to bring things into fruition, but you got to have a vision. There's a parable that says, with no vision the people will perish, right?
Yeah.
So I always am very conscious about understanding what it is I want, focusing on it, and just having a clear vision to make it happen in the best way that I can. And often, if it's the right vision, then I am blessed with the opportunity to make those things happen. And if it's not, then I get, turned in the right direction. It may be heartbreaking at the time, but it actually ends up being better for me.
That's an incredible story, right? From a little girl who wanted to be the princess.
Yes, I wanted my picture in the book, and this is that famous wave.
That's exactly right. To a budding young adult who understood the power of persistence.
Yes.
Right. So I want to say that again, because I want to make the audience understand the vision of I want to be a princess to the power of persistence. Yes. Because that means that had to be work with the vision. And what you just personified is work with the vision, and how that vision grew with you to something even more powerful.
Yes.
So now you're getting ready to come out. I'm assuming you came out of Spelman, getting ready to come out of Spelman. What made you look at corporate America?
I don't have a traditional trajectory. So, part of, I'm probably parents' worst nightmares when I talk to kids, because they're like, don't listen to what she said. Because with all the vision that I had, a lot of times I lacked a lot of focus,
Right.
Honestly. And it took a minute to be able to fully, I don't think I had a plan. I think a lot of things, and I don't have a traditional path to success or trajectory to how I got to here. A lot of it has been sort of divine intervention and guidance, honestly. But
Very
then
nice.
being able to tap into what I was capable of, being a great communicator, being a great visionary, being a connector of people, definitely played a role into my success. I ended up in the advertising industry out of college. I worked at Leo Burnett in Chicago. And that really came out of needing a job, for the summer, and not taking the path that everyone else did in college, where they would go to the client, the office, and look at the internships and get an internship. I think this is probably my junior year, and it's like, oh shit, excuse my language. I probably should get a job and focus on what's next in my life.
What's next? Yeah.
Yeah, because my parents had threatened that I had really one bad semester, and it was the semester that I was the beauty queen, that, I failed
Right.
that semester. I had a 1.8 GPA that semester, but I had a damn good time that semester.
That semester.
It was amazing. But my parents were like, oh, guess what? You're going to have to pay for that semester. And you also probably won't be able to get a job with a GPA like that. You're going to have to come back to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and you're going to, have to go to the UA and get a whole different degree. I mean, just like the serious pressure of your life is going to be crap because you failed a semester of college. And the threat of having to move back to Tuscaloosa, Alabama was huge. And the other threat of my mom sending me newspaper ads of being a manager at Glamour Shots. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, I
Glamour
know Glamour Shots.
It was like, that's the only type of job you're going to be able to get with those type of grades. I mean, just the psychological, warfare they were playing.
Yeah.
Just committed to doing something different. And so I was able to figure out, I liked advertising, marketing, didn't really know that was a real job to have. But one of my friends was just, excited about Leo Burnett, and she had pictures of the wall of the apples and, what that meant back in the big pencil. And I had no idea what it was, but it just so happened that they were going to be in, at our counselor, at our job fair, a career center at the time. And someone else mentioned that, oh yeah, I have an interview. And I was like, oh, maybe I should go to this interview or see if I can get on the schedule. Long story short, got on the schedule, got to interview there, and got a job as a media buyer planner, just because, I was a math major at one point during the time. I changed my major 3 times. I had communication skills, and I had taken an internship the summer before at a company called Telerep, for free. And I was trying to get to New York. They said they weren't paying. And I was like, okay, great. I won't explore that, opportunity. But the person at Telerep in New York ended up calling on my behalf, because I had no intentions of calling and working a free internship,
Right.
but called the local lead of Telerep in Atlanta and connected us. And they called me and said, hey, we hear you're interested in a job. And I said, sure. And ended up working with them for the summer. But that gave me that media television experience from the, the business side. And that helped me get the job at Leo Burnett in Chicago, which at the time was like the #1, ad agency in the world. And with Leo Burnett on your resume, it was sort of like a calling card to any other agency that you would want to work for. And what was so powerful about working at Leo Burnett at the time was that they had a training program called the PIT, which was like a persons in training program, which allowed you, if you didn't have that direct experience of advertising and marketing, I was an English major when I finished, they would train you. And I think that's the beauty of, at that time at Leo Burnett, is they weren't keen on advertising majors. They wanted people who had transferable skills.
Right.
People who had, you could be an effective writer, communicator, you had some analytical skills, and they would teach you the Leo Burnett way, right? And how to do it the way that they conduct their business. And I think, even today, as people talk about how do we find more diverse talent and get people into the industry, you have to be willing to invest in people who have these transferable skills, but teach them how to use those skills to do the work that you need to do. Because I think once we're given the option and the opportunity, the access to do the work, all we need is that one connector that turns on that light bulb in our head of how we can do the work that works best for them. And it just opens up the pool of talent. So getting to Leo Burnett and working there for about a year and a half, and then I switched over to the sales side for an entrepreneur at a company called the African Heritage Network. And that's how I ended up in New York City, and sort of the rest is history from there.
Interesting. That's a very interesting path. And one of the things that I don't believe in is happenstance. So there's no such thing as happenstance. There's connectors, as you mentioned, within that story and that content. And those connectors actually are the strings that pulled. And once those strings were pulled, it automatically drew you forward to where you should be. So now you're in the big city now, right? So you're a Southern girl in the big city now, and you're now starting to accelerate in your career. What was the first hurdle you think you met in that acceleration path?
So, and I think this is how I'm in the DE&I space today. And what I found, just to take a quick step back to Leo Burnett, is being one of the only Black professionals in a particular group. I worked on the Kellogg group in the media buying and planning section. But what I did see were Black leaders at the next level. So there was a Black woman media supervisor. There was a Black media associate media director. And then there was a Black woman media director. So I did see a path. So it's so important. I have to say that I never felt like, oh my God, I don't have an opportunity, because I could see the path of success if I wanted it there at Leo Burnett. But at the time, there was also, in this media marketing space, and as a buyer planner, you control what advertising happens in certain programs, what ads go into magazines. But there was a gap in terms of Black-owned media and what type of advertising dollars got submitted in there. And so that was probably one of the first times that I saw there was a need for voices like my voice in this industry, because our media properties were not being bought, not because they weren't quality properties, but the value of them was not placed there.
Right.
Or the media buyers were not so connected to the importance of the African American consumer that they weren't giving it its true value. So I was able to kind of my first, I don't want to call it a hurdle, but it was like one of those challenges where I had to justify buying a Black media magazine that was specifically targeted to health, and exactly what the target was. It just so happens that it was on about Black health, Black health conscious people, with Heart and Soul magazine at the time. But I succeeded using the footprint and blueprint that they had created for other mainstream magazines. And so that was my first aha moment of, there has to be a voice attached to minority-owned businesses. Somebody has to be an advocate for that. And so moving to New York, working for this company called the African Heritage Network, which was a syndication, these are all these old terms that syndicated television, where, like, at the time, Oprah Winfrey was a syndicated show. So it's on multiple networks, but it's bought as a group. But the education on the sales side to educate media buyers and planners, the importance of minority-owned media, the minority-owned consumer, was so heavy. So I started in a teaching mode the value of minority media, Black-owned media, the value of the Black consumer, the Hispanic consumer happened then. So again, that path and that string being pulled that you mentioned, that was happening then. So I think the challenge was just educating people on the value of minority-owned media, the value of minority-owned consumers, what we bring to the table, and getting people to just shift their mindset in terms of what they thought and how they valued who I was, who the people who were like me were in terms of our consumer and buying power. So if there was anything, I think it was just that constant teaching mode. And I see it still exists today. We're still proving in showing the proof point of the value of minority-owned media and having people that look different from the quote-unquote mainstream, what it actually brings to the table when you're inclusive of different audiences and you're creating an equitable space for media buys, pay equity, any of those things when it comes to people who are othered.
You know, you harped on something that we always say in within this podcast, and you know they can't be what they can't see,
Yes.
right? So you saw likeness up the food chain.
Yeah.
And so because you saw that likeness up the food chain, you know, that was an opportunity for you to move in that direction. And
There was
then,
a possibility. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the concept of trying to impress upon, especially in the media market, which is when we were growing up, was heavily slanted to an area that wasn't conducive of portraying African Americans and any brown or black skinned individual in a positive light, for you to go through and have that first struggle of showing the value of
Yeah.
how that medium can be used for good, and it has an attached percentage of equity associated with it, and you have to understand how you get that equity in that product to have a voice to push that forward. So I find that very fascinating, right? Because it shows, again, that we talked about earlier, that persistence and voice that somehow has been imbued with your upbringing, and we're seeing it show itself right now. So that's fascinating to me, and audience, I hope you understand and can see those ties as we go through this conversation with Adrianne. So now you've got the first big push there. Now you're showing value to the organization. Help me understand, help the audience understand, like, what was your next steps? What were you planning to do next?
You know, a part of me, if I think back, I don't think I had an idea. I worked for lots of entrepreneurs, and saw how they were all in different space, trying to create space for people that look like us. So I think I was bit by that bug of creating space, creating understanding, as long as we have access and opportunity, we can. So working for entrepreneurs, my father was an entrepreneur. Maybe I was just inspired by trying to do my own thing with the support of creating new space and opportunities. So I ended up working for Vanguard Media, which at the time was where the internet was just launching and popping. And, you know, so I worked, I don't know if you remember these names, Keith Klinkscale and Lynn Burnett. They were really big, or still are, in this Black media space. And we launched Vanguard Neo Media, which at the time would have been sort of the urban version of DoubleClick. And
Right.
DoubleClick was an ad rep firm that sold ad space in all of these websites. So we were going to do it for all the urban websites and the Black-owned websites. And I led sort of that sales charge. But at the time, I think very soon after the internet, there was a bust and everything like
Yes.
crashed, right? So then I was just kind of charged with figuring out what next in my own life and space, and various opportunities of trying to create a digital billboard, and how in Harlem, like before, digital billboard was like the thing to do, and it was like $1 million to create, you know, buy a screen, or having the opportunity to work for an agency with a dear friend of mine who's passed away, David Prince, and leading the course for this campaign called the Verb campaign, which is kind of a precursor to what Michelle Obama was doing with her Let's Move campaign, but it was called Verb. It's what you do. So about getting young people active and out in the streets. So that was kind of my first time of doing my own thing in business. And then when you have mentors and sponsors who support you like that, and David Prince was one of those key things. And if I just take a quick minute to say, get a sponsor, get a mentor, young people, who's ever listening, no matter how old you are, you got to have other people who are cheering and rooting and kind of pulling your own string when you don't have sense enough to pull it yourself.
Yeah.
But he connected me to Howard University, and that's when I worked as the first and only executive director for the Center for Excellence in Advertising there. And although it was, and they were sponsored actually by the 4A's, the American Advertising Association. I know I just butchered that, but it's the 4A's. If you guys look that up. But really, and the point and purpose of that was, again, to get more people that look like us into the advertising industry and folks with non-traditional skills to do the work that we do. We know it's not brain surgery. We know that if we just have access and opportunity, we learn the lingo, the language, that we will be successful. And we had a program that was called a boot camp, a CEA, Center for Excellence in Advertising boot camp, and we also had a lateral movers program. And again, that story about finding those folks with transferable skills, giving them the insight, the education that they need, introducing them to the agencies where they do the practical work, but you also have the academic work that's attached to it, and watch how they thrive. And I'd say that program was over 10 years ago. 68% of those people who were in our program are still in the advertising industry today.
Wow.
So just amazing. But it just shows, when they say they can't find you, they can't find this talent, how hard are you really trying?
How are you looking? Yeah.
Where are you looking? And then, are you investing in that talent that you say you want? Because that's the key. If we have access and we have the opportunity to learn and be connected in the right way to the business that you want us to be in, then I think we'll succeed. And so I think that's been one of those driving things too, is how can I provide access and opportunity for us and people from underrepresented communities to get into this industry. So that story is important about Howard University, because it taught me a few things. And one is the importance of connections, and number one, someone speaking for you, getting you in a space and you thriving and building something, because I was just given a book and said, build this, and I was able to do it. But the relationships that were formed then, the success of the program was incredible. That actually, when I talked about that 68% of the folks still in the program, Love Malone, who is the founder of The Gradient, was one of the people who was in that program. And she actually worked for Ogilvy at one point. She started as, she got a job and worked at BBDO as a director. Speaking of transferable skills, she was in pharmaceutical marketing, got a job as a director on a pharma account at BBDO, and ended up being a global director at Ogilvy on another pharma account. But, her experience with the program that I ran inspired her so much that she said she wanted to be able to give back, create a talent search path for agencies to find great talent and for talent to find great agencies. And so out of that has grown The Gradient and what it looks like today. But that was kind of that key point that showed, those connections, what you can do. And she came back 8 years after having not seen her, telling me that she was going to Cannes Lions. And I thought she was talking about the Cannes Film Festival.
Right.
But she said, no, this is the Cannes Lions International Festival of Creativity, where all of the advertising marketing leaders go and they celebrate. It's the whole awards thing. It's like the Oscars of the advertising industry. And I was like, I want to go, I want to be up in there, right? So she's like, okay, yeah, come with me. Mind you, the trip was in 2 weeks and I was scheduled to go to Cuba the next day. I was like, bet, well, I'm going to go to Cuba. And while I'm there, I booked a flight. I had to go through Turkey to get there, but I got to Cannes that year. And, it changed my life, David. Like when I tell you, the trajectory of my life shifted in a way that I had not imagined. But imagine going to this festival of creativity, and 16, and I always get what thousands, but it's like 15 or 16,000 people were attending, but only 200 look like us.
Wow.
Should I say that again? Like out of the 15,000 people, this conference, only 200 look like us. And that included folks from Africa, the UK, and the US. And out of the people that look like us, most of those were entertainment. They were the entertainers. Those folks who may have been working there. but none
Right.
of us were there leading the key thought leadership. There weren't a lot of jurors there who looked like us. But the
Right.
topic of conversation that particular year was about how can we make Cannes Lions more inclusive? And I literally thought it was a trick question. I looked around like, are you serious? Like, you have to invite us here. You have to, oh, how about let us know it exists, right? And create opportunities and access. It's not a cheap, you know,
Yeah.
thing to do when you're going. And most people are invited by their companies and organizations. But I went as a voyeur that year. So that means I didn't have a pass to go because the passes were, $4,000 or $5,000 to get access. But the beautiful thing about it is they have these fringe events that don't necessarily require badges, but you can get in, and once you're there, you see people that imagine living in New York City, but you don't see this person until you get to Cannes. So the question is, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Right? Imagine that. So it's because it's like once you're there, it's like, oh, you're in the inn, right? You
Mm.
know something that somebody else doesn't know. You're here. And a beautiful thing is somebody else that was a part of my program at Howard was there. Ran into him randomly because all the Black people you see, you automatically give them the nod,
Getting the
right?
nod.
You may not say anything, but you see him, you do that
Yeah.
nod. Like, I see you,
I
you're
see
here.
you.
And we did like this hug and scream, like, oh my God, what are you doing here? And he's like, Adrianne, the only reason I'm here now is because of the program that you ran, 8 years ago. And since then I've won 6 Cannes Lion Awards. And this is like amazing, right? I'm like, oh great.
Wow.
If it was I'm the reason that those awards belong to me.
To
So
me,
make sure
yeah,
you
it's
send them
ship
over.
them over to me.
Ship them over. But he said that opportunity created a space for him to earn his way through the ranks where he is, and allowed him to be a Cannes Lions winner. So imagine, I was like, that there's something to this. And that next year I decided to bring 5 young people back. I think it's important to say that I was not working for anyone, still, like, I call myself a hustler, still working for myself, finding ways and opportunities to create for other folks. But the 5 young people that I brought in 2018, David, they showed up and showed out, right? They were in some of the Young Lions academies, and just randomly I ran into one of the deans of one of the academies, and they talked about how the trajectory of the conversation where those young people were totally shifted. It changed how they were thinking, how they were teaching the class. Even the deans of it just were like, we were inspired and had to
Wow.
look at things differently. And they were like, oh, and there are these 2 Black girls from America. And I was, really, who are they? And they said, Jenna and Alex. I was floored because those are the young women that I brought, right? Those are the
Nice.
women that I gave the opportunity to, or created the opportunity for them to come. And, what even touched me more was one of the young ladies said, without this program, I never would have known that I could compete on an international level, or that I had an option to live somewhere else outside of the United States. And that's when I was like, damn it, I got to do it again. I got to inspire more young people to do this. And in 2019, I was able to bring 25 young people back to Cannes Lions. And we hosted the first diversity, equity, and inclusion activation ever in the history of Cannes Lions. And we
Wow.
called it Inkwell, after the Martha's Vineyard Inkwell
Yeah, the
in
movie. Yeah.
Massachusetts. Yeah. Yeah. And, Inkwell, just to tell that short story, Martha's Vineyard here is that came from, a lot of the rich white people in Boston would come to Martha's Vineyard to vacation, and they would bring their Black help. And Inkwell, which was actually called Towns Beach at the
Mm.
time, was the only beach where the Black people were allowed to swim. So the white folks called Towns Beach, they affectionately called it Inkwell. And so, of course, how we do, we, took advantage of that name and made it a sense of pride, that it's literally the worst beach there, but it's the best beach in terms of where we gather, where we connect on the vineyard. So many people, Black people of influence go. It's just a place of pride to be able to go and connect and find a moment to recharge and go back out there. So that's what I named the Cannes Lions, first ever diversity, equity, and inclusion activation ever in their 60 plus year history. after that special place there. And it, that story is important for me because when I thought I was creating a space for me and for people that look like us to belong, the reality is that more people who didn't look like me said, thank you for creating this space, because it's the first time that I ever felt like I belonged at Cannes Lion. You create a space for all of us to come. And one of the things that we would say is welcome home when people would come in. It
Nice.
didn't require a badge. You just came in, you got some great thought leadership. Gail King and Mark Reed, who is the CEO of WPP, his first return, he came to Inkwell with Gail King and she interviewed him. So that's how the energy was there. Naomi Campbell was there, Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade, they were some of our key speakers that year. But it was just amazing and an extraordinary space. And, I think it's just kind of a testament of when you create access and opportunity for people to belong, that's where they come. So.
Hey, I love the reach back. We have always been accused of being crabs in a barrel.
Yeah.
We meaning Black people and people of hue. And a lot of times when we climb, we forget to reach back. And I love the story of reaching back. I also love the story and the content of the mentorship and sponsorship and the importance of that to help you continue to climb. I was going to ask you, how did you shift to become a chief diversity and inclusion officer? But I think I know.
I mean, that opportunity at Cannes, I think, you have people that see you. Judy Jackson is one of those women who saw me and said yes to me. You have to have people in your life that say yes to you. And Judy Jackson said yes to me. Vita Harris said yes to me, and they were very important in terms of the build of Cannes Lions and the Cannes Lion, my organization called the Cannes Diversity Collective. And, Judy, very critical role in terms of me getting back into the corporate space, because she created an opportunity for me to be the first global director of inclusion at WPP, the largest, holding company at the time in the world, which set the stage for me to then become the senior vice president, senior partner, chief diversity and inclusion officer at FleishmanHillard, an agency whose mission is to become the most inclusive agency in the world. So how about that string pull to become a part of FleishmanHillard, where that mission is that, from the leadership down to all the people within the organization, FleishmanHillard has been committed to finding a space for us to belong. And, you talk about places you're supposed to be. You always think when you're back in a corporate space or when you're doing a DEI job, that's a whole nother podcast in itself. We'll have to put a pin in that. But the founder of FleishmanHillard, Alfred Fleischman, was a Jewish man who was very committed to his community and the unification of his community. But he was also the president of the National Urban League in St. Louis. So committed to bridging those communities. And if you know much about the National Urban League, it's primarily focused to build up, the Black community and, focused on uplifting and creating opportunities there. But for the founder to be committed to inclusion and creating a way for people to communicate and understanding that there will be moments that you don't always agree. But if we could communicate in a way that helps us get along and we both feel like we have a space to belong, that's where you want to be. That's the way you want to communicate with others. So to be a part of an organization whose foundation was built on the spirit of inclusion, for me, I could not have, been pulled in the right direction. And, for the mission now, even with our current CEO, John Saunders, who put out the new mission of becoming the most inclusive agency in the world, it just seems like it's a great fit for where I am today.
I can't think of any better way to end the podcast than to end it on that.
Yeah.
The power.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
That's important. And it's important because if we have young people listening to this podcast and it's about relationship building. And we touched on a little bit about sponsors. I heard a story once of a woman who talked about how when she was the chief something at company X, all of, whenever she wanted to go somewhere, she got VIP passes to every event. Her phone was always popping off, calling people, inviting her here and there. And, she was just always the go-to person. But as soon as she left company X and she just became, we'll give her name Sally, and she just became Sally, her phone stopped ringing, the invitation stopped. No one was checking for Sally anymore because she no longer was associated with X. So my encouragement to young people is allow people to know you for who you are and your authentic self outside of the job that you work for. Build relationships, create opportunities for people to talk about you when you're not in the room because of the work that you do and who you are as a good, trusted human being. And just imagine what threads will be. You notice how I'm using your term now? What threads will be pulled for you with that. So just, the human connections that you make are everything versus the companies that you work for. I truly believe that I've been able to get to where I am to now just because of people who talked about me in a good way and sometimes bad when I was not in the room, and who said yes to me. So keep building those relationships and those human connections. The work of DE&I is about human connections. And I don't think you could do anything else without those.
So Adrianne, that is content that's gold and content that's real. And I do want to ask you one more question before we close out the podcast. Think about 7-year-old Adrianne.
Yeah.
Wanted to be the beauty queen. What would you go back and tell her now?
I would say keep dreaming, girlfriend. Like, you have no idea what's ahead of you. Don't doubt yourself. Keep visualizing, keep believing. You will have some disappointments and people that you thought were connected to you in a way that were not, that look like you. But know that as long as you have that good vision and you're on a path that's connected to your passion, you're going to win. So don't forget that you will win.
I love it. Well, thank you, Adrianne, for your candid responses and joining me on the ride. This has been an impressive ride for me. Your story is unbelievable.
Thank you.
The way things were woven and how you've come to where you are today, and the doors that you've opened, continue to open those doors, continue to guide, because they can't be what they can't see, and we have to be seen. I want to thank you, my audience, for joining me on the ride as well. This has been an outstanding ride, and I appreciate everyone. Thank you very much. Until next time.